The autumn sun had barely pierced through the clouds when Officer Mark Thompson slid into his patrol car. The crisp morning air carried a quiet stillness that only small towns seem to preserve. It was routine, predictable, just the way he liked it. A town like Cedar Ridge didn't get much excitement, but Mark didn't mind. For him, the calm meant control. But this morning would be different. As Mark sipped his bitter coffee, his eyes landed on a car driving down Maple Avenue, a sleek, black luxury sedan. The vehicle gleamed against the dull backdrop of the town's worn buildings and cracked roads. To him, the car screamed money, but not the kind of money Cedar Ridge typically saw. It made him suspicious. Out of place, Mark muttered to himself, lowering his coffee cup. Inside the car sat Angela Brooks, her hands firmly on the steering wheel. The faint hum of classical music played in the background, a habit she'd developed during long drives to keep herself calm and focused. A week of back-to-back trials as one of the top defense attorneys in the city had drained her, and she was relieved to finally head home to visit her mother. Angela wasn't unfamiliar with how this car, her car, attracted unwanted attention. Growing up as a black woman in America had taught her that certain luxuries often led to assumptions. Her mother had warned her, time and again, people judge what they don't understand. She carried that warning with her, folded like an old letter in the back of her mind. As Angela drove, she noticed the police cruiser parked ahead on the side of the road. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. She whispered to herself, "Not today, please." Mark narrowed his eyes as the car passed him, watching the driver, a woman, black, mid-30s. Something prickled at the edge of his mind, a bias he didn't dare admit to himself. Why's she driving that kind of car through here? Without hesitation, he turned on his flashing lights. Angela's heart sank as the red and blue glow reflected in her rearview mirror. She slowed the car, pulled to the shoulder, and let out a deep breath, steadying herself. It wasn't her first time being pulled over. She reached into her glove compartment, retrieving her license and registration with deliberate movements. Movements she knew were necessary to protect herself. Outside, Mark adjusted his belt and approached the driver's side window. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, as if announcing his authority with every step. Angela rolled down the window, her face calm, but her heart racing. "License and registration," Mark said curtly, barely glancing at her before his eyes scanned the car's interior. "Good morning, officer." Angela handed him the documents without question. Her voice was steady, polite, practiced. Mark took the papers and examined them. "Where are you headed in such a hurry this morning?" he asked, though her speed had been perfectly within the limit. Angela raised her brows slightly, but kept her tone measured. "I wasn't in a hurry. I'm visiting my family." Mark looked at her license again, reading her name aloud. "Angela Brooks, Cedar Ridge address." He looked at her sharply. "This your car?" "Yes, officer," she replied, irritation flashing in her eyes before she blinked it away. She'd worked her whole life to get where she was, graduating top of her class, winning cases that others thought impossible. And now, here she was, being questioned for simply existing in a car she'd earned. Mark's suspicion lingered. He felt something off, though he couldn't place it, or wouldn't admit where it came from. For several moments he stood silently, holding her license and registration, his gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Angela's knuckles whitened as she gripped the wheel, but she said nothing. Instead, she watched Mark's reflection in the side mirror as he walked back to his cruiser, clutching her papers. Inside his car, Mark ran her license through the system. No warrants, no violations. Clean. His jaw tightened. He didn't like it, how his assumptions about her were proving wrong. Frustration simmered beneath the surface, but his radio crackled before he could dwell on it. "All units, we've got a major accident on Route 14. EMTs requested immediately. Multiple injuries. Any nearby officers respond." Mark grabbed the receiver. "Thompson here. I'm 2 minutes out. Heading over." He glanced back at Angela's car. She was still waiting, hands visible on the wheel. For a brief moment, the doubt that had clouded his judgment began to clear. His duty was calling. Mark exited his car and walked briskly back to Angela's window. "Listen," he said, voice clipped. "You're free to go." Angela blinked up at him, surprised. "Everything okay, officer?" He hesitated. Pride made him almost turn away without answering, but his radio buzzed again. "Route 14 is bad. We need all the help we can get." Mark let out a breath. "There's an accident. I've got to respond." Angela sat up straighter. "An accident? I can help. I'm a trained paramedic." Mark froze, staring at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. "You're… what?" "A paramedic," Angela repeated firmly. "Before I went to law school, I still remember the protocols, and I keep an emergency kit in my trunk. Let me help." For the first time in his career, Mark felt something shift. His instincts warred with his bias, but the urgency in her voice left no room for hesitation. The accident was bigger than his ego. He cleared his throat. "Follow me," he said, his voice gruff but resigned. Angela nodded and rolled up her window. As Mark walked back to his car, he glanced over his shoulder. In that moment, he didn't see a suspect, a stranger, or someone out of place. He saw a woman, calm, capable, and ready to help. Angela pulled onto the road behind him, her heart still pounding, but now for a different reason. Neither of them knew it, but the next few hours would change everything. The two cars raced down the narrow country road, tires humming against the asphalt as sirens pierced through the calm of Cedar Ridge. Angela followed Officer Thompson's cruiser closely, her focus sharp. Her law degree and courtroom victories felt irrelevant now. She was tapping into skills she hadn't used in years. The protocols, the pressure, the adrenaline, all came flooding back. Mark's jaw was tight as he gripped the steering wheel. His mind buzzed with thoughts he couldn't fully grasp. A paramedic. The woman he had pulled over, Angela Brooks, he now remembered, had flipped the narrative on him in an instant. He hated to admit it, but his assumptions had been wrong. When they rounded the final bend onto Route 14, the scene came into view, and all lingering doubts were shoved aside. The accident was worse than either of them had imagined. Two cars were mangled together, twisted metal and shattered glass littering the pavement. One car was overturned, smoke rising from its crumpled hood. A van sat off to the side, its front caved in, and a family huddled near it, shaken but mostly unharmed. Screams carried through the air, underscored by the distant wail of oncoming sirens. Mark swerved to a stop, barely shifting into park before he jumped out of his cruiser. Angela pulled up just behind him, grabbing her first aid kit from the trunk. Her heels, ill-suited for emergencies, were abandoned in the car. She ran barefoot toward the wreckage, her pulse steady but quick. "Brooks, stay back!" Mark barked instinctively. Angela shot him a look that could cut through steel. "Don't tell me to stand back. Help me, or get out of the way." Mark paused for only a second before following her lead. Something about the way she carried herself in this chaos made him realize she knew exactly what she was doing. Angela crouched next to the overturned car first. Through the cracked windshield, she could see a young man in his 20s, unconscious, his head slumped against the window. Blood trickled down his forehead. She knocked on the glass. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. Mark arrived beside her, scanning the scene. "I'll check for fuel leaks. We don't need this thing catching fire." "Good," Angela said briskly. "If you've got a fire extinguisher, keep it close. We're going to need to stabilize him before we move him." Mark sprinted back to his car while Angela worked quickly, her hands steady as she assessed the man's injuries. His pulse was faint, but there. She used gauze to control the bleeding on his head, her movements swift and precise. "Come on," she murmured under her breath. "Stay with me." Behind her, Mark returned, fire extinguisher in hand, just as a faint groan escaped the man's lips. Angela looked up, relief flickering across her face. "He's coming around. Help me get this door open." Mark didn't hesitate. Together, they pried at the twisted metal until the door creaked. Finally giving way, Angela reached in carefully, supporting the man's neck. "Hey, can you hear me? You're okay?" "I'm here to help." The man's eyelids fluttered, and he coughed weakly. Angela looked over her shoulder at Mark. "We need EMS here now. He's stable for the moment, but he needs a stretcher." Mark lifted his radio. "Dispatch. We need medical units here immediately. One male, early 20s, unconscious but stable." "Roger that, Thompson. Ambulance 2 minutes out," came the crackled reply. Angela nodded, her focus unwavering as she continued to keep the man stabilized. Meanwhile, a woman's desperate screams caught Mark's attention. Across the road, near the wrecked van, a mother was kneeling beside her young daughter, who lay limp on the grass. Mark's stomach turned at the sight. "I'll check the kid," he called to Angela, who gave a quick nod. Mark ran across the scene, dropping to his knees beside the mother. "What happened?" "She's not moving," the woman sobbed. "She hit her head on the window when we crashed." Mark's hands were shaking as he leaned down to check the girl's breathing. It was faint, but there. He had no medical expertise beyond basic first aid, but Angela's voice echoed in his mind. "Help me, or get out of the way." "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Mark said firmly. "Let me work." Angela had finished stabilizing the young man when she glanced across the road and saw Mark hunched over the little girl. Her chest tightened. "God, please let her be okay." Grabbing her kit, she sprinted over, dropping down beside them. "What's her status?" Angela asked, her voice low and professional. "She's breathing, but weak. She's unresponsive," Mark said quickly, his earlier stoicism replaced with genuine concern. Angela pulled a pen light from her kit, gently lifting the girl's eyelids to check her pupils. "We need to keep her airway open. Help me lay her flat." Mark followed her lead, his movements mirroring hers. He didn't ask questions. He just did as she instructed. By the time the ambulance arrived, Angela and Mark had stabilized both the man and the little girl. EMTs rushed in with stretchers, and Angela stepped back, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her bare feet were scraped, her hands stained with blood, but her expression remained composed. Mark stood beside her, hands on his hips, his breathing heavy. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time that day, he realized how wrong he'd been. "You saved their lives," he said quietly, his voice rough. Angela turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I did what anyone would do." Mark shook his head. "No, you did what you could do. Not everyone has that in them." Angela didn't reply. Instead, she glanced at the little girl being loaded into the ambulance and whispered, "I hope she's okay." Mark followed her gaze, his chest tight with an unfamiliar mix of emotions: respect, shame, and something that felt like gratitude. As the ambulances sped off, the chaos finally quieted. The road was littered with debris, but the worst was over. Angela turned to head back to her car, grabbing her heels from the pavement. Mark watched her go. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat. After a moment, he called out, "Brooks!" Angela paused, turning slightly. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Angela gave him a long look, then nodded once. "Be careful out there, Officer Thompson." With that, she walked back to her car, leaving Mark standing in the middle of Route 14, grappling with the truth of the day, that the woman he'd misjudged so harshly had become the reason 2 lives were still breathing. For the first time in a long time, Mark Thompson didn't feel like the man he'd thought he was. The next morning, Cedar Ridge buzzed with quiet conversations about the crash on Route 14. The small town had little news to occupy its residents, so stories spread like wildfire. Everyone heard about the young man saved from the wreckage and the little girl pulled back from the brink. But what caught even more attention was the unlikely duo at the scene. Officer Mark Thompson and Angela Brooks, the woman he'd pulled over just moments before. Mark sat at his desk in the small, dimly lit police station, nursing his third cup of coffee. His mind kept drifting back to Angela. Her calm under pressure, her confidence, her professionalism. It unsettled him. The day before, he had nearly let his prejudice cloud his judgment. But instead, she'd stepped in and shown him what true strength looked like. He hated how wrong he'd been, and worse, how obvious it was now. "You good, Thompson?" Mark looked up to see Sergeant Ron Harris leaning against the doorframe. The sergeant was an older man, gruff but fair, with decades of experience that had shaped him into a man of few words. "I'm fine," Mark muttered, though the dark circles under his eyes told another story. Harris raised an eyebrow. "I heard you were out at Route 14 yesterday. That lawyer, Angela Brooks, saved the day, huh?" Mark stiffened. She knew what she was doing. Former paramedic. "Yeah," Harris said, nodding thoughtfully. "You know, I met her dad years ago. Good man. He was one of the first black engineers in Cedar Ridge's steel mill." Mark blinked. He'd never heard that. "She's made a name for herself, that Angela," Harris continued. "Top attorney in the city, community volunteer, and now a lifesaver. Guess people like her don't come along often." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He looked down at his coffee cup, shame boiling beneath the surface. Harris gave him a knowing look before stepping away, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, across town, Angela sat at her mother's dining table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The cozy room smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, the comforts of home enveloping her. Her mother, Evelyn Brooks, sat across from her, watching her daughter closely. "You're quiet this morning," Evelyn said finally. Angela sighed, shaking her head. "It's nothing, Mama. Just yesterday was a lot." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "It's not just the accident, is it?" Angela paused, staring into her tea. "It's that police officer, Mark Thompson." Evelyn leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "The one who stopped you?" "Yes," Angela replied. "He pulled me over for no reason. I could see it in his face. He assumed I didn't belong in that car. And then, minutes later, we were standing side by side, saving lives. It was surreal." Evelyn studied her daughter for a moment. "And how do you feel about him now?" Angela frowned. "Honestly, I don't know. He's a product of this place, this system. I could see the struggle in him yesterday, like he didn't know what to make of me." She shook her head. "It's exhausting, Mama, always having to prove who I am." Evelyn reached across the table, squeezing Angela's hand. "You don't owe anyone proof of anything, Angela. You showed him the truth without saying a word. Sometimes actions speak louder than arguments." Angela smiled faintly, though her thoughts remained unsettled. But, on that afternoon, Mark found himself parked outside Angela's childhood home. He wasn't sure why he was there. All he knew was that something inside him wouldn't let go of yesterday's events. The crash, Angela's bravery, and the realization that he had misjudged her. For several minutes, he sat in his cruiser, debating whether to approach the house. Just as he decided to drive away, the front door opened. Angela stepped onto the porch, her gaze locking on the police car immediately. Mark cursed under his breath, but forced himself to open the door and step out. Angela's expression was guarded as she crossed her arms and waited for him to approach. "Officer Thompson," she said coolly. "Ms. Brooks," Mark replied, his voice gruff but unsure. I wanted to stop by." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Mark swallowed hard. He wasn't used to apologizing. "I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday. You saved that man's life. And that little girl." Angela studied him carefully. "And?" Mark's jaw tightened as he forced the words out. and I was wrong. I pulled you over because I made assumptions. That was unfair. I'm sorry." Angela's expression softened slightly, though she didn't let him off the hook so easily. "You were wrong," she said quietly, "but at least you're admitting it." Mark nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. "Look, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm trying to do better." Angela let out a slow breath, her arms uncrossing. "Trying is a start, Officer Thompson, but it's not enough to just say the words. You've got work to do." Mark nodded, humbled. "I know." They stood there for a moment in silence, two people from different worlds connected by the events of a single day. Finally, Angela spoke. "There's a community meeting tomorrow night at the rec center. It's about rebuilding trust between the police and the people in this town. You should come." Mark blinked, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," Angela said firmly. "If you're serious about doing better, then show up." Mark hesitated, his instinct to refuse warring with the guilt and shame gnawing at him. After a beat, he nodded. "I'll be there." Angela gave a small nod in return. "Good." Mark turned to leave, but before he reached his car, Angela called out, "And Officer Thompson?" He turned back. "Thank you for listening," she said. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was somewhere in between, like an open door, slightly cracked. Mark nodded once more, then climbed back into his cruiser. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, both in him and in the town he thought he knew so well. Angela watched him go, a quiet hope flickering in her chest. People didn't change overnight, but sometimes all it took was a moment of truth, of clarity, of connection, to start something new. And maybe, just maybe, Mark Thompson's moment had come. The Cedar Ridge Community Recreation Center hadn't been this full in years. Rows of plastic folding chairs stretched across the room, every seat occupied. Some residents stood along the walls, arms crossed, eyes sharp. There was a nervous energy in the air, like everyone knew something important was about to happen. Angela Brooks stood near the front, holding a clipboard and scanning the crowd. Her mother, Evelyn, sat in the second row, offering her a reassuring smile. Angela had been one of the key organizers of this meeting, a town-wide discussion aimed at rebuilding trust between the police force and the community. She hadn't been sure Officer Mark Thompson would come. Part of her suspected he wouldn't. After all, showing up would mean confronting people who saw him as part of the problem, herself included. But she'd invited him because she believed in accountability, in second chances, and in the power of showing up. Angela glanced at the clock. It was 6:59 p.m. The meeting was about to start. Then the door opened. Every head turned as Officer Mark Thompson walked into the room. The air grew even heavier. Dressed in his uniform, Mark looked stiff, uncomfortable, like a man walking straight into enemy territory. Whispers rippled through the crowd, quiet but sharp. "What's he doing here?" Of all people. Typical. Angela's gaze met his, and for a brief moment, Mark felt like turning around and walking right back out the door. But her look held steady, firm, but not unkind. She gave him a small nod, and he took a deep breath, forcing himself to move further into the room. Angela stepped up to the microphone as the clock struck 7. The murmur of voices died down. "Good evening, everyone," Angela began, her voice steady and confident. "Thank you for coming tonight. This meeting is about transparency, accountability, and rebuilding trust. Our goal is to have an open, honest conversation about how we move forward as a community." Her words were met with a few nods, but there was still tension in the room. Angela continued, "For too long there's been a divide between law enforcement and the people they serve, our people. It's a gap that's widened with mistrust, misunderstanding, and real mistakes that need to be addressed. Tonight we talk about that, we listen, and we start figuring out how to fix it." Applause broke out, tentative at first, then building. Angela glanced at Mark, silently inviting him to step up. Mark's throat felt dry. He hadn't spoken to this many people since his academy days. He adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of every eye on him as he approached the microphone. Angela stepped aside, giving him the floor. Mark cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium. "I know a lot of you don't trust me," he began, his voice low but steady, "and I understand why. For a long time, I've seen things through my own narrow perspective. I've made assumptions, bad ones, that have hurt people. I can't change the past, but I can tell you this. I want to do better." The room was dead silent, save for a baby cooing softly somewhere in the back. Mark scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces. People he'd pulled over for minor infractions. People he'd ignored when they needed help. People who had every right to dislike him. "I'm not here to make excuses," he continued. "What happened the other day, when I pulled over Ms. Brooks, was a wake-up call. I stopped her because of my own bias, plain and simple, and I was wrong. Minutes later, I watched her save 2 lives while I stood there, not knowing what to do." Angela's expression remained neutral, though her eyes softened slightly. Mark swallowed hard. "The truth is, I've spent years thinking I knew this community. But I didn't. I only saw what I wanted to see. I've let prejudice cloud my judgment, and for that, I'm sorry." A murmur rippled through the room, some skeptical, some surprised. Evelyn Brooks watched him intently, her brow furrowed. "I'm here tonight because I want to listen," Mark said finally. "I want to understand what you've been saying for years, and I want to help make things better. I know words aren't enough, but this is where I start." He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. For a few agonizing moments, no one said anything. Then, a man in the back, one of the town's elders, stood up. "You're right about one thing, Officer Thompson," the man said, his voice carrying through the room. "Words aren't enough, but showing up, that's a start." A few people nodded in agreement. Angela stepped back up to the microphone, her voice calm but firm. "Accountability begins with showing up. Officer Thompson isn't the only one who needs to do better. We all do. This town can't heal if we're not willing to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is." The discussion that followed was raw, honest, and at times heated. Residents shared their stories, run-ins with the police that had left scars, moments when they'd felt unheard, unseen, or unfairly targeted. Angela facilitated the conversation, ensuring everyone had a voice, while Mark listened, truly listened, for the first time in his career. There were moments when Mark wanted to defend himself, to explain, to push back, but each time he forced himself to stay quiet and absorb the truth in the words being shared. It wasn't easy. It felt like holding up a mirror and seeing every flaw in sharp detail. At the end of the night, Angela closed the meeting with a simple statement. "This is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when we show up, speak up, and refuse to stay silent. Thank you all for being here." As people began filing out of the rec center, Mark lingered near the back, feeling both drained and oddly hopeful. He caught Angela's eye as she packed up her things. "You did good tonight, Officer Thompson," she said, walking over to him. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't say much." "You didn't need to," Angela replied. "Sometimes listening is the loudest thing you can do." Mark looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest smile. "I guess I've got a lot more listening to do." Angela smiled back, this time with genuine warmth. "Good. Just don't stop showing up." As Mark walked out of the rec center into the cool night air, he felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor he'd worn for years. The road ahead wasn't clear, and it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Mark Thompson felt like he was finally on the right path. The days after the community meeting brought a noticeable shift to Cedar Ridge. Whispers of what had happened at the rec center carried through coffee shops, diners, and barber shops. For the first time in years, it felt like something had cracked open. Not broken, but exposed. Angela Brooks noticed it in subtle ways. Neighbors who had long kept to themselves were beginning to ask questions and share their frustrations more openly. Even Evelyn noticed the change. "People are starting to believe they can be heard," she said one evening as they washed dishes together. "That's because of you." Angela didn't take her mother's praise lightly. She'd fought hard for years to have a voice in a town where her success was often met with skepticism. But even as she celebrated the small progress, she knew that change was fragile and pushback was inevitable. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Thompson found himself facing a different kind of pressure. At the police station, the atmosphere had grown tense. Some officers avoided him entirely, while others openly questioned his actions. Mark had never been the most popular guy, but he'd always been one of them. A loyal officer who kept his head down and didn't rock the boat. Now, he felt like an outsider in his own precinct. "You're making us look bad, Mark," Officer Ray Sanders sneered as he passed Mark's desk. Ray was one of the older officers, gruff and unapologetic about his views. "First, you go to that damn meeting, and now people are looking at us like we're the enemy." Mark didn't respond, but his silence didn't deter Ray. "Don't forget which side you're on," Ray said coldly. "Or maybe you already have." Mark clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew what Ray meant. The line between loyalty and accountability in the department had always been blurred, and by admitting his mistakes publicly, Mark had crossed it. 2 weeks after the meeting, a storm rolled into Cedar Ridge, the kind of late autumn rain that turned the streets into rivers and darkened the skies for days. Angela was in her office downtown, catching up on paperwork, when her phone buzzed. It was Evelyn. "Angela, baby, you need to get over here," Evelyn said urgently. Angela sat up straighter, sensing something in her mother's voice. "Mama, what's wrong?" "It's about Mark Thompson," Evelyn said, lowering her voice. "I just saw it on the news. Someone vandalized his house." Angela's eyes widened. "What?" "They spray-painted his garage, broke his front window. They wrote things on his property, nasty things." Evelyn hesitated. "Angela, they're calling him a traitor." Angela's heart sank. Traitor. She'd heard the word thrown around before, used against anyone who dared challenge the status quo, even in small ways. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and keys and headed straight for Mark's house. When Angela arrived, Mark's small, single-story home looked like a crime scene. A patrol car was parked in the driveway, its lights flashing, and 2 other officers stood outside, speaking quietly. The word "traitor" had been spray-painted across the garage in bold, red letters. A rock lay near the shattered front window, surrounded by shards of glass. Mark stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but Angela could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he clenched his jaw as he spoke to one of the officers. Angela stepped out of her car, ignoring the looks she received from the other officers. Mark turned, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Angela approached cautiously. "I heard what happened. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Do I look okay?" He gestured toward the house. "Whoever did this, someone I work with probably knows them. Hell, it might be someone I work with." Angela studied him, her voice calm. "Have you filed a report?" Mark nodded. "Yeah. Doesn't mean much, though. This'll get swept under the rug. They'll call it a prank, and everyone will move on." "Not everyone," Angela said firmly. Mark looked at her then. Really looked at her. And for the first time, Angela saw the full weight of everything he was carrying. His decision to show up at the community meeting, to admit his mistakes, had cost him more than he'd anticipated. And yet, he'd done it anyway. "Why are you here, Brooks?" Mark asked quietly. "Because you don't deserve this," Angela replied. "And because you're not alone." Mark scoffed, though there was no real bitterness in it. "Feels like it right now." Angela took a step closer, her voice soft but firm. "You're trying to change, Mark. That scares people. They don't know what to do with it, so they lash out. But this isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning." Mark stared at her for a long moment, the anger in his eyes softening. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Angela paused. "Because change matters, and because you showed up when you didn't have to. That counts for something." Mark looked away, exhaling deeply. For all his faults, and there were plenty, he had never been a coward, and he wouldn't start now. "What do I do now?" he muttered, almost to himself. Angela placed a hand on his arm, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You keep going. You keep showing up. Let the people who did this know that you're not going anywhere." Mark nodded slowly, her words settling into him, like a steadying force. "Thanks, Brooks." Angela smiled faintly. "Just don't make me regret believing in you." He shook his head, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in the faintest ghost of a smile. "I won't." As Angela walked back to her car, the rain falling steadily around her, she felt a flicker of hope. Mark Thompson wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying. And maybe, just maybe, Cedar Ridge would follow his lead. Inside his broken home, Mark stood alone in his living room, staring at the shattered glass and the red spray paint on his garage. The words still stung, but they no longer felt like a defeat. Angela's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning." For the first time in years, Mark believed that might actually be true. The following week in Cedar Ridge was heavy with tension, like the moments before a storm. Mark Thompson, still reeling from the vandalism at his home, returned to work, knowing he was walking into a firestorm. His patrol car had been cleaned, but he still parked it far from the others in the lot. The word traitor felt tattooed on him now, invisible but burning through every glance from his colleagues. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into outright confrontation. "Thompson!" Mark turned to see Ray Sanders striding toward him across the station's common room. Other officers glanced up, pretending not to watch but hanging on to every word. "You file that report about your house yet?" Ray sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "What did you put in it? Someone doesn't like me because I'm trying to be a hero?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he refused to take the bait. "What's your point, Ray?" Ray stepped closer, his smile fading. "My point is, you're making the rest of us look bad. You show up at one of those community meetings, throw us all under the bus, and what happens? They trash your house. You think that's going to make anyone respect you. You're a joke, Thompson, to them and to us." Mark's fists curled at his sides. A younger version of himself might have thrown a punch, but the past few weeks had changed him. Instead, he looked Ray square in the eye. "You know what's a joke, Ray? Pretending everything's fine when it isn't, ignoring the problems because it's easier than fixing them. I made a mistake, and I admitted it. Maybe you should try doing the same sometime." The room fell silent. Ray's face turned red, his fists clenching. For a moment, it looked like he might swing at Mark, but instead he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Mark glanced around, meeting the wary eyes of his co-workers. He could feel the weight of their judgment, but he didn't care. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was standing for something that mattered. Across town, Angela was back in court, her presence commanding as always. The Brooks versus State case had drawn attention from local media, Angela defending a young black teenager accused of a crime she believed he hadn't committed. The evidence was flimsy, the arrest questionable, and Angela was relentless in exposing the cracks in the prosecution's case. But there was more on Angela's mind than the courtroom. After hearing about the vandalism at Mark's house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the town's progress was hanging by a thread. Change was hard enough, but in a place like Cedar Ridge, it felt almost impossible. That afternoon, after her case adjourned, Angela stopped by the police station. She didn't call ahead, and she didn't care who saw her. When she walked into the station, heads turned. She ignored the stares and made her way to Mark's desk, where he sat reviewing paperwork. "Brooks?" Mark said, surprised. He stood up quickly, his gaze flicking toward the others in the room. "What are you doing here?" Angela raised an eyebrow. "Can't a citizen stop by to check on her local police?" Mark smirked faintly. "You're here for something else." Angela's expression grew serious. "Can we talk? Privately." Mark nodded and led her into a small conference room, closing the door behind them. Angela crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "How's it been since the vandalism?" Mark sighed, leaning against the wall. "Rough. Some of the guys think I betrayed them. The rest think I'm just soft." "You're not soft, Mark," Angela said firmly. "You're doing what's right, and that takes guts." Mark looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Doesn't feel like it sometimes." Angela stepped closer, her voice low but insistent. "Listen to me. Change isn't comfortable. It's messy. It's hard. But the fact that you're standing in the middle of this storm, still showing up, still listening, that matters. People are watching you, even the ones who won't admit it." Mark looked up at her, surprised. "You think they care what I'm doing?" "Of course they do," Angela replied. "You're proving that it's possible to change, that someone can confront their own bias, admit their mistakes, and do better. That's more powerful than you realize." Mark let her words settle, the weight of them sinking in. For so long, he'd thought of himself as a product of his environment, bound to the way things had always been. Now he wondered if he could be something more. Angela turned to leave but paused at the door. "I'm organizing another meeting this Friday, this time with the mayor and local leaders. You should come." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be there." Angela gave him a small smile. "Good. Keep showing up, Thompson. It's how change happens." That Friday evening, the second community meeting brought a larger crowd than the first. The mayor and town council sat at the front, along with representatives from the police department, local clergy, and business owners. Angela stood at the microphone, leading the conversation once again. This time, Mark sat in the front row, his uniform freshly pressed, his back straight. The tension was still there, but so was something else. A quiet determination, a sense that the town was ready to take its first, tentative steps forward. "I want to share a story," Angela said, her voice carrying through the room. 2 weeks ago, Officer Thompson admitted to me that he made assumptions about me when he pulled me over. He judged me without knowing me, and he was wrong. But instead of ignoring it, he admitted it. He showed up, he listened, and he's working to change. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Angela turned to look at Mark. "That's not easy to do. It takes courage. And it's the kind of courage this town needs if we're going to move forward." Mark's throat tightened as Angela spoke. He hadn't asked for her to defend him, but hearing her say those words felt like a lifeline. He stood up, clearing his throat as he approached the microphone. "Angela's right," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I made mistakes. I still have a lot to learn. But I'm here because I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. And I know I'm not the only one who can do better. If I can change, so can Cedar Ridge." The room fell silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, a few people began to clap. The applause grew, hesitant at first, but soon the entire room was filled with the sound. Mark looked out at the crowd, his chest tightening as he realized something. For the first time, they weren't looking at him with anger or judgment. They were looking at him with hope. As Angela and Mark exchanged a small nod, they both knew the work was far from over. But for now, it was enough to know they'd taken another step forward, together. The applause from the community meeting still echoed in Mark's mind the next morning, but so did the faces of his fellow officers. The meeting had been a success, or at least a step in the right direction. But not everyone in Cedar Ridge was ready to accept change. By noon, Mark had returned to the station, greeted by an icy silence. A few officers glanced at him but quickly looked away, whispering in corners like students avoiding the teacher they'd just disrespected. He had grown used to it over the past few weeks, but this time it felt different. As Mark sat at his desk, flipping through paperwork he couldn't focus on, the door to the chief's office opened. Chief Harris, a man in his early 60s with a quiet but commanding presence, stepped out. His deep voice carried through the room. "Thompson, in my office." Mark swallowed hard, standing as the rest of the room fell silent. His fellow officers avoided his gaze, some smirking, others with faces carved from stone. He stepped into the chief's office and closed the door behind him. Chief Harris sat behind his cluttered desk, his face hard to read. "Have a seat, Mark." Mark sat, his hands instinctively resting on his thighs as he braced for whatever was coming. Harris leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "You stirred things up at that meeting last night." Mark met his gaze, unsure how to respond. "I said what needed to be said." "Maybe you did," Harris replied, his voice steady. "But some people in this department aren't happy. You're starting to make enemies, Mark." Mark's jaw tightened. "So what? I'm supposed to stay quiet. Pretend everything's fine?" Harris let out a heavy sigh. "I'm not saying that, but change takes time. Pushing too hard, too fast. It's going to make things worse before they get better." "Maybe worse is what we need," Mark shot back, "because the way things are isn't good enough anymore." Harris stared at him for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching Mark's face. "You're right," the chief said finally, his tone softer. "But that doesn't mean the pushback won't come. You need to be ready for it." Mark frowned. "I don't care if they don't like me." "You will care when you're out there alone," Harris replied firmly. "When backup doesn't come, when you're the target for people on both sides. You've already been through enough. I'm just telling you to keep your head on straight." Mark leaned back, nodding slowly. He appreciated Harris's honesty, even if it didn't make him feel better. "I can handle it," Harris smirked faintly, as though seeing a younger version of himself. "I hope you can, Thompson. I really do." Meanwhile, Angela was facing her own pushback. The Brooks v. State case had reached its final days, and Angela's defense of the teenager had been strong, methodical, and backed by facts. But during lunch that day, as Angela sat in a local cafe reviewing her closing arguments, she noticed a pair of men watching her from the next table. They weren't subtle. One of them, a man in his 40s with a baseball cap and a thick build, leaned over, muttering just loud enough for her to hear. "Figures. Stir up trouble in court and stir it up in town, too." Angela looked up calmly, meeting his gaze. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the man sneered. "This town was fine before you came back, telling everyone how broken it is. People like you think you're better than us." Angela didn't flinch. She'd faced worse in courtrooms packed with people who wanted her to fail. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said evenly. "I think Cedar Ridge can be better for everyone. Maybe that scares you." The man's expression darkened, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood up. "Watch yourself, lady. Some people don't appreciate what you're doing here." Angela didn't respond, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. She watched as the two men left the cafe, her pulse steady despite the anger simmering inside her. When Evelyn called later that afternoon to check in, Angela didn't mention the incident. "How's the case going, baby?" Evelyn asked. Angela sighed, leaning back in her office chair. It's going well. The truth is on our side. That's all that matters. Is it? Evelyn said knowingly. You and I both know the truth isn't always enough in this world. Angela closed her eyes for a moment. Her mother was right, as always. The truth didn't always win, but that didn't mean you stopped fighting for it. Satu Somdin. The final breaking point came that Friday night. Angela had just left her office when her phone buzzed. It was Mark. Brooks, he said, his voice tense. Can you come to the station? Now. Angela's heart skipped a beat. What's going on? It's urgent, Mark said. I'll explain when you get here. 15 minutes later, Angela pulled up to the Cedar Ridge police station. Rain pelted her windshield as she stepped out, clutching her coat tightly around her. Inside, Mark was waiting for her in the empty lobby. What's happening? Angela asked, scanning his face. Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustration written all over him. There's been a break in your case. The kid you're defending? The one they arrested? New evidence just came in tonight. Angela's stomach tightened. What kind of evidence? Mark sighed. Video footage. Proves the kid wasn't anywhere near the scene when it happened. Angela's eyes widened. What? Are you serious? Mark nodded. Dead serious. It clears him completely, but… Angela's heart sank at the word but… But what, Mark? But someone at the station wanted to bury it, Mark said, his voice low. They were going to sit on it and let your kid take the fall. Angela stared at him, stunned. You're saying… I'm saying it's a cover-up, Mark interrupted. And I'm not letting it happen. I pulled the footage myself. You need to see it, and you need to take it to court first thing tomorrow. Angela felt a surge of emotions, relief for her client, fury at the corruption, and gratitude for Mark. Why are you telling me this? Mark looked her straight in the eye. Because it's the right thing to do. And I told you, I'm trying to do better. Angela nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his decision. You realize this could cost you your job, right? Mark exhaled. Yeah, but some things are worth the cost. Angela reached out, resting a hand on his arm. Thank you, Mark. He gave a small nod. Just make sure that kid gets justice. As Angela left the station, clutching the evidence that would change everything, Mark sat back at his desk, feeling the storm raging inside him. He had crossed yet another line, but this time, it didn't feel wrong. It felt necessary. And in that moment, Mark knew there was no turning back. The next morning, Angela stood at the courthouse steps, holding the evidence that could change a young boy's life. The rain from the night before had cleared, leaving the air crisp and the skies pale blue. Despite the calm morning, Angela felt the pressure of the moment. Inside, the courtroom was already filled with people, reporters, families, and townsfolk who had come to see the conclusion of Brooks' first state. Angela had spent weeks defending Marcus Jackson, a 17-year-old boy accused of burglary and assault, a charge she knew was based on flimsy evidence and bias. The prosecutor entered confidently, as though victory was certain. Angela stayed seated, her briefcase resting on her lap, but her heart pounded steadily. At the defense table, Marcus sat nervously, his mother clutching his hand. You ready for this? Angela whispered to him. Marcus swallowed hard and nodded. Yeah, I think so. When court came to order, Angela stood and began the proceedings. Your Honor, before we proceed any further, the defense would like to introduce newly uncovered evidence. The prosecutor frowned, clearly caught off guard. Your Honor, I object. This is last-minute evidence. It wasn't disclosed earlier. Angela turned calmly. This evidence was not available to the defense until last night because it was deliberately withheld. This footage will prove my client's innocence. A low murmur swept through the courtroom as the judge adjusted her glasses, looking sternly at both sides. I will allow it. Proceed, Mrs. Brooks. Angela nodded to the bailiff, who set up the screen. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, a clear, time-stamped surveillance recording showing Marcus at a gas station miles away from the crime scene at the exact moment the incident occurred. The evidence was undeniable. Marcus's mother let out a muffled sob, clutching her son tighter. Across the room, the prosecutor's confidence deflated as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Angela stepped forward. "Your Honor, this footage exonerates my client. He was nowhere near the scene of the crime. I respectfully request that the charges against Marcus Jackson be dismissed immediately." The judge turned to the prosecution, her expression sharp. "Do you wish to proceed in light of this evidence?" The prosecutor hesitated, his face red, before shaking his head. "No, Your Honor." "Then the charges are dismissed," the judge declared firmly, banging her gavel. "Marcus Jackson, you are free to go." The courtroom erupted. Cheers from Marcus's family, gasps of shock from onlookers. Angela turned to Marcus, a triumphant smile on her face. "It's over," she said quietly. Marcus's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Thank you so much." Angela squeezed his shoulder. "Go celebrate with your mom. You've got your life back." And that afternoon, the news spread like wildfire. Marcus Jackson's name was cleared, and Angela Brooks had become even more of a local hero. Reporters called for interviews, but Angela declined most of them. She didn't do this for praise. She did it because it was right. At the police station, the fallout was swift. Chief Harris, along with outside investigators, began looking into how the evidence had been suppressed and who was involved. A quiet reckoning rippled through the department. Officers who had ignored or turned a blind eye to corruption found themselves in uncomfortable positions. Some would face disciplinary action, others would resign. And Mark Thompson? He sat quietly at his desk when Chief Harris called him into the office again. "Thompson," Harris said, studying him carefully, "you're the one who pulled that evidence out, aren't you?" Mark nodded. "Yes, sir." "You went against protocol and possibly against your own colleagues to make sure the truth came out," Harris continued. Mark's jaw tightened. "I did what was right." The chief let out a slow breath. "You're walking a thin line, Mark. But I'll tell you this, you did the right thing. I'm not sure everyone else in this department will see it that way, but I do." Mark blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Chief." "Don't thank me yet," Harris said. "You've got a long road ahead of you. But I think this department might finally be ready for a change, and you'll be part of it, if you're up to the task." Mark stood straighter, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I am, sir." That evening, Angela sat on the porch of her mother's house, sipping a cup of tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a rare, quiet moment after weeks of chaos. Evelyn joined her, settling into the chair next to her. "You did good today, baby," Evelyn said, pride shining in her eyes. "That boy is free because of you." Angela smiled softly. "He deserved a chance. They all do." Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And what about that Officer Thompson? What do you make of him now?" Angela glanced at the road, where the faint sound of a patrol car drifted through the evening air. "I think he's trying. He's still got a long way to go, but he's showing up. That matters." Almost as if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance, and a familiar police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Mark stepped out, still in uniform, but looking slightly more relaxed than usual. Angela raised an eyebrow as he approached the porch. "Didn't expect to see you here." Mark shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "I thought I'd stop by. Figured I owed you a thank you." "For what?" Angela asked, genuinely curious. "For pushing me to do better," Mark said simply. "And for not giving up on me, even when you had every reason to." Angela studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're the one who made the choice, Mark. I just gave you the opportunity." He smirked faintly. "Still, I'm grateful." "Evelyn, watching the exchange with a knowing smile, stood up and patted Angela's shoulder. "I'll leave you two to talk. I've got a pie in the oven." As Evelyn disappeared inside, Mark leaned against the porch railing. "So, what now?" he asked. Angela sipped her tea, her gaze steady. "Now, we keep going. The work isn't done, not here, not anywhere. But if we keep showing up, we can change things." Mark nodded, her words settling into him like a promise. "I'll be there," he said quietly. Angela smiled faintly. "Good. Just don't expect me to go easy on you." Mark chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." The two of them sat in companionable silence as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple. Cedar Ridge wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but tonight there was hope. Hope that people could change. Hope that the truth could win. Hope that a town divided could find its way back together. And as Angela and Mark sat there, two people who had once stood on opposite sides of an invisible line, they both knew that this was just the beginning of something better.